Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 PM GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. We had a good day yesterday in Colchester, and interesting people turned up, as interesting people do. The main thing about all this, I think, is that yesterday Cliff, who put the talk on, and his sons put a lot of effort into leafleting the local community. Now, bearing in mind that these people are going to have 45,000 houses built on their doorstep and their infrastructure completely changed, you might think that you'd get quite a bit of interest from the public. Well, the people who seem to be interested in this are quite a minority. We get quite a lot of people at our talks, but when you think about it, if you saw a leaflet that came through the door and it was questioning the validity of what was actually going on, and you kind of knew that there was some problem with public participation, then wouldn't you actually get involved? And this is my question, really. I think that the majority of people, as we said over the last couple of shows, seem to have got so dumbed down that they are unwilling or unlikely to engage. So it's up to the determined few to make a difference. And the determined few are making a difference. And we're going to talk about that tonight. And also how the state has really degenerated itself and everyone else. Quite interesting stuff, this, in our quest to uncover what's behind all the social engineering. But first of all, I'd like to tell you about some forthcoming events. On Saturday, 14th of December, 11 till 6 p.m, the bigger picture is at the Steiner Academy in Hereford. And it's £10 on the door. You can contact biggerpicturehereford@gmail.com. And it's a very interesting place, Hereford. And I hope to have people from that area coming to see us. I've spent quite a lot of time around there, that sort of area, around Monmouth, and really like it down there. So I'm looking forward to that one. In 2020, that's next year, Saturday 25th, we're in Fairbourne, Gwynedd in North Wales at the Freeog Fairbourne Village Hall, Beach Road, Fairbourne. There's an Eventbrite bookings page on the homepage of Windows on the World, so do have a look at that. On the 22nd of February, we're in Worthing, East Sussex, and there is an Eventbrite bookings page for that too. So do have a look at that. And tonight we're actually going to be going over an interview and some new information from Sea Levels expert Niels Axel Morner, who has been an IPCC, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change contributor for many years, and has now resigned his position basically because of the computer modelling and really out-and-out fraud being perpetuated by this organisation. And I'm going to be referring to an article that's on windowsontheworld.net. I'll just give you that article before we start. It was about 18 months ago, and it's called Sea Level Rise is Fake News. And this ties directly into our talk at Fairbourne, because Fairbourne is going to be suffering from a thing called managed retreat, which means that the people there are going to be forced out of their homes eventually because coastal defences are not being renewed. Now, Niels came onto that show, Sea Level Rise is Fake News. Have a look at that. And also the interview that we did, because I'm going to be putting some more stuff out during the week. In fact, tomorrow there'll be a new video up with a summation of what this is about, because it's very, very important and ties in to what's really going on in coastal places all over the country. This is going to be rolled out because obviously the agenda is to get people into the smart cities. The actual video is called Sea Level Expert versus Climate Lies Destroying Communities. And we're going to be talking a bit about that tonight and how it fits into, the bigger picture. But basically, we're going to get, tonight, the state actors. That's what we're talking about. The state actors lying for a living. And we'll be covering the UN IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, versus real science, and the liars and cheats at every level of society and public engagement. Now, we have covered this quite a lot, but I've got some interesting information tonight that I'm going to put out. So our last show was called UK Shamed into Stupidity, and it described the manipulation of public opinion. And this week, there's obviously going to be more on this, and it does tie in to these forthcoming talks, especially that one in Fairborn. Now, the facts of the matter are the only antidote to a stream of lies, and the insertion of half-truths to pacify those who consider themselves to be cynical of the party line makes this group of waverers easy to manipulate. Now, just take that in for a minute, because it's something I thought of earlier, and I think this is really important. That basically, when we're dealing with facts now, we're dealing with people who are immune to facts. So if you've got facts, we've got people who are immune to facts. And basically, people are very susceptible to half-truths. In other words, this movement could be a bit co-opted. I mean, they don't agree with everything I say, but I'm going to join it anyway. Big mistake. And that's what we're going to get into tonight. Basically, people who are slightly wavering on issues will always be compromised. And also, groups are of no use whatsoever unless they address a single issue, because they get co-opted. And every single movement that I've ever come across in this country has been subverted, which is why we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, which is working in small groups and having a bit of fun. Now, that sounds radical, doesn't it? Fun. Now, this is another thing, the term limited hangout. Most people might be familiar with this who listen to the show, but what a limited hangout is where people go, voice their opinions, and basically they're in an echo chamber, and they're allowed to get away with certain things, and basically the narrative is controlled by people who operate the group. And there's a lot of these limited hangouts around, but the insertion of half-truths to pacify those who consider themselves to be cynical of the party line does make them easy to manipulate. I think that's the important thing here. Over the years, I've seen a lot of these gatekeepers come and go. In fact, I've been looking at this for about 15 years. And when that Free Men on the Land movement came in, that was quite interesting, actually, because some of those things it brought up were very important, but it quickly got co-opted into a real pantomime. And people came up and started taking it over. Narcissists turned up. And of course, the whole thing degenerated. And of course, the courts got wise to it and said, you're not doing that in here. And why would they? Why would they let you do that? It's their court after all. I mean, a very funny thing that happened was when we went to Wales to challenge a council tax case and put the birth certificate in the dock. When the police turned up with tasers, after the clerk of the court could not get control of the court, and he couldn't get the people in a public gallery to stand up. Therefore, the magistrates couldn't sit down and had to keep leaving the bench. Very comedic. But what happened was the police turned up and they were very sympathetic to us, actually. They turned up with tasers, sweating, and ran in and saw these people. Thought, well, this is interesting. But their sergeant was on the side of the court. So we had this kind of standoff where the police were kind of interested in what we were doing. He said, well, I can't see them doing anything wrong. And the sergeant was desperately trying to get them on board to take the view that the clerk of the court I'd said that we should all be arrested and taken out of the court because we didn't stand up. You can still see it on YouTube. It's called Councils, Courts and Conmen, or Free Man Standing in Court. Quite an amusing day, actually. I think that's the thing about these things as well. They become very inspiring and they can lead you on to other things. But if you stay in the same rut and keep following the same thing over and over again, you are doomed to failure. I think that's the point there. But the main point here, I suppose, is that once you compromise something which is true and allow other points of view to come in and manipulate the outcome, which is what in effect happens to every group, especially those who might have some effect, then you may as well be telling lies, as any misinformation outside what is absolutely true poisons the well completely. This is something that I've been bringing up with people recently, and not everyone gets it, because a lot of people say, well, at least I'm doing something. Well, if you want to just at least do something, join the poisoned well of Extinction Rebellion, then you're doing something, aren't you? I mean, a lot of this activism really is going up the cul-de-sac, and that's a bit of a shame, really, because people put a lot of energy into things, and it's a shame to see it wasted. I've been thinking about this a lot because of the talks that we're doing and how effective they can be, and we have been meeting some people who are very organised, and they are likely to carry this forward in a way that groups cannot do. And we were talking about this till quite late last night outside a pub in Essex, and it was taken on board by all sides. So, yeah, we had a good time last night. It was very good fun. But let's get back to this. Whether it is those who spout a bit about common law, and this is an epidemic still, and birth certificates, and then what happens is they spout this stuff about common law and birth certificates, and then they'll entirely miss the point of a court case. In other words, the remedy will actually be there, and they'll completely miss it by putting colons in front of someone's name and saying Mr. Jones of the Mr. Jones of the Charter family, or Mr. Jones of the Jones family, or whatever it is, you know. And basically, this is really a way not only to lose a court case, but to lose all credibility too. So these things, I think they're quite funny now, but I've seen all this stuff fail in court. And in actual fact, when I was going to win a case against the council, a load of free men on the land types turned up, and they wouldn't stand up when the judge told them to. And we were going to win the case. And so it was counterproductive. It was like, no, we're going to win. Stand up. The judge is on our side. We've brought this case and the judge is here for us, you know. It was very, very comedic. But we did win the case, actually. And I'm going to be talking about that in weeks to come. I did a talk on some of these aspects of it in Lytham St Anne's. And I'd like to do more on this because it's very fundamental to the way the system works. And I've come up with quite a lot of remedies over the years. And we used to have this website called landofthe.free.co.uk, which is gone now. But I've still got all of the information from there, and it's very, very relevant. And it goes into how you deal with the police, how you deal with forms, especially that you have to fill in, because you obviously don't have to use forms, you use your own paperwork at all times. All this stuff I find endlessly fascinating. But yes, probably do a show on that in the next few weeks. Going back to this, though, what happens is the biggest narcissists in these movements get listened to, and though they actually appear to be gaining ground, it all falls apart. And I've seen this time and time again. There is an antidote to all this, though, and it's to work in groups of 2 or 3 people, just to reiterate that. The idea that the public could now demand a real citizens' assembly is an idea which is unincorporated and has no leader. Now, that's incredibly important. Now, this could be a great lobbying tool, which, if used effectively, could be a lot of fun, and it could pull the rug from the subversives controlling the public. This is what I'm thinking. Along with this, the appeal to authority is an argument that no longer has standing in the eyes of the public. Now, this is something I was going to put into the show because it ties into the way that the public opinion is controlled, the narrative is controlled. This appeal to authority is no longer an argument because the authorities themselves are entirely corrupted and have lost all credibility, which makes the exposing of propaganda and lies in the manipulation of public opinion very, very difficult, because when you're up against the state lies and you're trying to counter them, then you've got a problem. It becomes like a counterintelligence exercise trying to just get your stuff over. And that's the point. When people are arguing from the point of a lie, it makes putting the truth over even more difficult, actually, because if they were arguing from the point of what they thought was true and it's a lie, then you could put your point over and have an argument. But we found this with these Extinction Rebellion people. They haven't got an argument, therefore they just lie, which makes it actually, in a way, more difficult because they're less likely to engage in any form of discourse. Which, of course, is the point of the social engineering of it all, really. That's what it's about. It's about emotion and feelings over facts, as stated by the grandmom of Extinction Rebellion, Gail Bradbrook. But most reiterated statements on behalf of the state have little or no standing now. The truth can look so outlandish, the public cannot believe that truth exists because the lies are so audacious. The professional liars or agents of change do infest all public office, and this is a major problem. State actors lying for a living, that's the title of the show tonight, yeah. Even those who appear to oppose the state are the state. So we've often discussed this, most recently in the case of this absurd and totalitarian state-backed globalist, anti-globalist group Extinction Rebellion. Now, getting back to Fairbairn and our talk there in January, about 18 months ago, as I said at the beginning of the show, I did an interview with leading sea level expert and IPCC author Niels Axel Morner. The subject was the agenda-led computer modelling of the IPCC. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And why Niels Axel Morner had stopped being a contributor to their AR reports. These are reports which drive global policy, by the way. So everything that's draconian and being implemented on you will be implemented through the UN IPCC, because that is the go-to governing body for climate data. I'm now going to refer to an article on windowsontheworld.net which ties in with our talk in Fairbairn again. I will also be covering this nearer the time of the talks. This is really important stuff. It's about this managed retreat of this small place in North Wales, and Niels Axel Morner, the leading expert in sea levels, has said he would defend them in court. When I wrote to their local action group in Fairbairn, we got no response. Now that means that the local action group has been co-opted by the council. Anything that says local action group is basically a co-opted group. I found out this through my dealing with these so-called action groups over the years. But let's get back to this. The fear-mongering is being used entirely to depopulate coastal areas, and the likes of the IPCC use flawed models and projections to push this political agenda. Now, our interview with Niels about small coastal communities going into this managed retreat is really about land grabbing and depopulating small communities. In other words, rewilding them. Rewilding is basically just privatization. It's not really giving it back. It's basically getting you off the land and controlling you, putting you into cities. And these areas that are being built, like the ones we referred to at the beginning of the show, the 45,000 new homes being built in Essex, just outside Colchester. This is going on all over the country. Everybody reports the same thing. But in the interview, Neil states that he will go to court over the claims that people will have to be relocated and properties in Fairbairn will become uninsurable and sea levels will rise. This will not and can never happen, the way the alarmists are propagandising, as the projections are absurd and impossible. Now, someone who is respected and considered an expert in his field, who actually shows ethics and stands by science, meaning to deduce outcomes from studying and basically analysing facts, is attacked viciously by even those who are working in the same field. Now, this is really what the crux of this whole show is about. It's about this basic evil that's at the heart of all these organisations, and we're going to actually go over why it's evil. But this is not the behaviour that real scientists are used to, and they find it puzzling, alarming, and in the end infuriating. This is the behaviour of the dishonest, those who are entirely disingenuous with noses in the trough, and those who have given up on their job role to basically reap the benefits of corruption. This also brings up an important point. One compromise means that truth itself has been compromised. So that's what I was getting to at the beginning of the show, that once you get into a group and the agenda slightly changes and you go, well, they don't believe in this, but they believe in some of the stuff I believe in, it's a waste of time. It will be taken over. That is the ideal situation for so-called change agents to come in and take over the narrative. And that's always what happens when there's a slight compromise with the agenda. It's a way to actually destroy what you're doing. Well, let's have a look. Like, it leaves us basically in the post-truth world. Now, this is funny. I want to just there's a bit of a side issue, but quite an important one. Like, dictionaries described post-truth world as word of the year in 2016, which in itself untrue, as it's two words which are exclusive of each other unless they are used in this way as a phrase. They can't be a word. Now, Oxford dictionaries have just declared climate emergency word of the year in 2019. Now, this one is even worse, as these two words cannot go together whatsoever. The weather systems of the Earth would never allow a climate emergency. That's just a fact, right? The weather systems of the Earth will allow for extremities in weather, which balances out elsewhere, but there will never be a climate emergency. There may be the odd tsunami, but there will never be a global climate emergency. It will never, ever happen. A climate catastrophe might happen, but that would be from an external force, like a large object crashing into the Earth, such as a comet or a meteor. But the weather won't do it. It is also one of the most blatant lies of recent times, as there's absolutely no sign of a climate emergency. That is how absurd the times we are living in really are. So, yeah, let's get back onto Fairbairn. Now, we have done several interviews with this world-leading expert in sea levels, Niels Axel Morner, and basically how this is part of the fear-mongering put out to take control of the climate change agenda and global taxation and basically population control. The fear-mongering is being used to depopulate these coastal areas. And our interview with Niels about small coastal communities going into this managed retreat is land grabbing. So, in the interview below, which is basically, this is an article which I just stated at the beginning of the show, the interview states that Niels will go to court over the claims. So what I wanted to get to was the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 1. Now, Niels has sent me a new paper that he's written about the IPCC, which I really want to read out. It's very, very important, and I'm going to put a post up on windowsontheworld.net where you can download it. Basically, this is about the first order draft of a report which was available for expert review in 2019. It was in April to June 2019. All the experts who submit comments on the first order draft will be invited to review the second order draft in March, April 2020. And it's open to experts and government representatives. Now, this is what Niels was going to be part of. Now, this is what he had to say about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the rise in sea levels. He said, "I have been an expert reviewer 1999, this is for the IPCC, 2003 and 2013, when I withdrew due to the exceptionally low quality of the sea level chapter. I am a sea level specialist," says Niels. Yes, indeed. "But just because I am a sea level specialist, it implies that I will guide my review with respect to science of sea level changes and its frames set by physical laws, accumulated knowledge, observational facts, and ethics, most importantly," because Niels and other scientists set up a website called geoethic.com. Now, the problem here is mainly that these scientists don't have a public voice. Once they leave these bodies, they are not known to the public. And because they work in academia, they are in an echo chamber with other academics, which is basically marginalised academics. This is why the public don't even know they exist. It's because they're not given access to them. And this is a constant problem, and one that I've been trying to solve for a long time. Because these people will put out expert-reviewed papers and they'll put out peer-reviewed papers. But these peer-reviewed papers aren't part of the control narrative. So the likes of Extinction Rebellion will believe that they don't exist. And that is a real problem. But basically, Niels goes on to state that physical laws, accumulated knowledge, observational facts, scientific ethical principles basically are the most important thing. Now, several of the authors, he said, engaged in the writing of Chapter 9, which is this sea level rise chapter in the IPCC report. And he said these authors have a background firmly fixed in the idea of a sea level acceleration soon to come. In other words, it's about mitigation for something that may happen in the future. Now, the IPCC have been 100% wrong in all of their calculations and computer models. 100% is pretty bad, but that's never brought up. Let's get back to what Niels had to say. This acceleration was announced in 1990 and they're pushed forward step by step because no such things were observed, always just claimed to start in the future. About 30 years have elapsed and still no traces of acceleration, just proposals. Now, it just considers literature favourable in view of the rapidly rising and acceleration of sea level scenario of the IPCC. In this matter, the chapter implies a total failure and must be rebuffed, says Niels. Every single example of a possible acceleration has been revealed as an error. And there he goes on to give a list of papers that have been published on the matter, which back up his assertions here. So he says, if we are indeed not dealing with a scientific document, all expert reviewing becomes quite problematic, because everything would in that case be a matter of pro or con. In a scientific review, all is about right or wrong, holding pro and con outside the review. That was what he says here. In science, there are ethical rules of how to behave. Besides the obvious rules of no plagiarism, there are the rules of all available facts on the table, never hide or ignore troublesome facts. If those rules are violated in a PhD defence, the thesis fails. And he says, I was myself in the jury at such a case. Chapter 9 is, of course, not a scientific thesis, but it claims that it is a scientific product. If it would have been a PhD thesis, it should have had to be rejected, because it only considers its own concept of a rapid and soon accelerating sea level rise in the text and illustrations as well as in the references listed. And he's listed things there in his conclusions. Now, isn't this fascinating? It only considers its own concept of a rapid and soon accelerating sea level rise. So in other words, it's something that they're just saying without evidence. Now, this is incredible for what the public believe is a scientific body. And if we did have a media, this would be all over the media. There are a few journalists who expose this stuff, like Delingpole, and there was Christopher Brooker, who's died last year. But these are so few and far between that they're marginalised by the vocal majority in the likes of The Guardian, who wouldn't know a fact if it bought them dinner. So basically, in all the previous assessment reports, he carries on, there has been a major shortcoming in the choice of authors and the focusing of the concept driven by the IPCC. This report is by no means better. This is when he's talking about the 2019 report. But basically, he's talking about the choice of authors here. Now, this is incredibly important because people say that it's done by scientists. Well, some of these people may be qualified in an area of science, but they're often not qualified in the area of science that they're actually talking about, which makes their assumptions. That's all they are. They're not expert witnesses. He says, in conclusion, this is a new lobbying product set to glorify the IPCC concept, i.e. the scaremongering of climate change with a global sea level flooding in the centre. Such a product cannot be reviewed in a meaningful way, just in meaningless pros and cons. And he says, carrying on in his conclusion, he says, in addition to conclusions 1 to 6, I want to say, the chapter is full of statements and information, but all of it devoted just to one thing: to glorify the IPCC concept of a rapidly, even accelerated sea level rise. The references mirror this mode of working. Alternative ideas, even firm observational facts, are ignored. This is also the case with the references. Though ambitious, this paper is nothing but a document meant to provide confirmation of the old IPCC idea of a sea level in rapidly rising mode where acceleration has been claimed but never documented by observations. The chapter is a remarkable product in terms of lobbying for the sea level rise concept, but this is not what it portends to be. It is claimed to be a scientific product, which it fails to be. So in short, a remarkable lobbying product for the IPCC, but a document failing to fulfil scientific standards. I really wish there was more people like Niels Axel-Morner and Dr. Tim Ball and Tony Heller out there who could actually get together. In a way, all of these voices are marginalised. They're marginalised by the media, and they're set up to be cranks, which is absolutely evil and outrageous, because these people have contributed to these organisations in good faith. As soon as you don't agree with them, then you are a crank. You're basically a lone wolf lunatic. And that is the problem with the whole of the set-up debate which comes out of the media. But this brings us to a much broader picture now, which goes along with the content of our shows. The repetition of statements by all media regarding the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assume it to be an independent scientific body, which of course it's not. It was started as the go-to place for controlling the narrative on climate policy, rolled out as the propaganda arm of a control and management system for the whole planet. It actually came out of a document called Our Common Future, where they recommended that it be created for this very purpose, a super agency under the UN, which would be a go-to place for all scientific data on climate. So, an infrastructure and management system for controlling and imposing regulation. That's all it is, on the back of an environmental ideology, which is the only reason climate data is manipulated for policy enforcement and control, plus management of global populations under the UN super agency. It's just a lobbying body for policy, rolled out through the UN, straight into local government, and directly, this is the important thing, it directly affects the habits, well-being and future of all those on Earth. So in effect, anything that lobbies for power and control through deception is, by definition, evil. This is so simple a concept that it's been absolutely forgotten about when looking at the deceptions occurring in every part of perceived external reality. Now, at this point, I'm going to get into the definition of evil. Now, it says here, if you refer to an evil, you mean a very unpleasant or harmful situation or activity. And then it goes on to say, higher taxes may be a necessary evil, which is totally contradictory. This description is from Collins Dictionary, and the statement about necessary evil is interesting, as no evil is actually necessary. Think of that. So higher taxes may be a necessary evil. Well, taxes aren't necessary. A lot of people argue about that. But in a real economy and a properly thought out economy, taxation would not happen. Taxation was only brought in to fund wars. That's the only reason it was brought in. So that's something to think about. Local taxation and levies applied by local councils came out of the Poor Laws, which was so draconian that they would put you into the poorhouse if you didn't pay them. They put you into involuntary slavery. So, yeah, let's look at an adjective of evil now. If you describe someone as evil, you mean that they are wicked by nature and take pleasure in doing things that harm other people. Now, this is an interesting area because these so-called trained puppets, change agents, and people in the public sector, by the very nature of the recruitment, they will recruit a lot of people who are either extremely narcissistic, sociopathic, or just generally evil. And that is the main problem with all public bodies. Their very recruiting process puts people in there that are evil. They're people who will rule by deception, which is definition of evil. Well, some people perceive the social engineers behind the imposed system as evil. I know we do. Some may well be evil. But the corruption of everything starts with a simple compromise. Getting back to what I was saying at the beginning. The corruption of everything and any kind of evil will come from a compromise in truth. Some people want to subvert truth entirely and lie. But that's where evil starts. The idea that this kind of negativity is put on the planet by external forces is also an interesting one. I wanted to get into that actually, because where does it actually come from? Now, I wanted to get a bit of an esoteric slant on it here. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, there is basically some very interesting quotes. Now, the Nag Hammadi scriptures were written by a group of so-called Gnostics and Christian authors, and they sort of are alleged to have been from around 200 AD onwards. They found at Nag Hammadi in Upper Nile in Egypt in 1945, and some of these were material from a thing called the Corpus Hermeticum, featuring the teacher who had this character. The teacher has a character called Hermes Trismegistus, and it's all believed to be from, around 200 AD. But what's interesting about it is that there's some very insightful quotes in that book, which is basically a compilation of these manuscripts, these leather-bound manuscripts that were found in a jar.
in 1945, if they were indeed found in a jar in 1945. When you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and what happened there, there's been an awful lot of stretching of the narrative. But it says basically, this is called On Beating the Archons from the Nag Hammadi. It's just a quote. It says, the rulers fight against the inner person. And that's where compromise happens, within the inner person. I think that's a really insightful quote. The rulers fight against the inner person. So in other words, you have to be compromised. If you just say no to something, then evil can't get in. But if somehow you have to consent to it, and that to me is the most interesting point about the way that the system works and the way that evil works. Very interesting point that. This one's from the Secret Book of James, which is a Christian text. It says, so I will tell you, be filled and leave no room for space within you empty, or he who is coming will mock you. That is incredibly insightful, I think, because it's about this willingness to compromise, or when you're unsure about something within yourself. So in other words, when you're unsure about yourself, that will be exploited by some external force. And this could be a supernatural force, or just your local puppet in the council office, But basically, this is the thinking of these so-called Gnostics or authors. And the system of law has basically been so corrupted now that those seeking truth, these ponderers who basically wrote these Gnostic texts, would have now basically declared an end of truth apocalypse and basically probably retreated into their caves forever. Okay, so let's move on with this now. But participating in that which harms others is being a party to evil, which hundreds of thousands of state actors are involved in. So basically, if you set into motion any action that has or propagates harm, then you are going against natural law. You are going against the natural system, and you're going against, in a way, yourself. But a lot of these people are so used to lying that they are inherently lying, which is where the evil comes in. So the public sector is full of evil, right? In fact, it has more evil in it than anything outside it. And this is really interesting, because what we find now is there's more corruption and lies within the police than within the public. This is an actual fact. And it's because of the way they're trained, and because of the way that they want to get their crime figures up. And if they turn up to something, they want as many defendants as possible. So they're working as policy enforcers, but that is inherently evil in natural law. Now let's get on to more state actors, think tanks, the war on terror, the war on people's minds, the propaganda factory. The use of think tanks and NGOs to control the public narrative is something we've covered in previous shows. Like the shadow government, which has been basically given complete credibility in the eyes of the public, now runs and controls the system of democracy. We were talking about this in our last few shows about citizens' assemblies. UK shamed into stupidity, our show last week, where the citizens of Oxford have been hoodwinked into accepting massive debt and basically having their lives micromanaged on the back of a huge lie. So that's inherently evil. The shadow government, as I said, which has now been given complete credibility in the eyes of the public, a national government in the UK, has now been proved to be merely a conduit for global policy by this implementation of these citizens' assemblies on climate change. Now, this is really important. The companies involved in steering public opinion are part of this new system of governance funded by George Soros and organisations who train the drones, who talk endlessly about change without actually defining it. So we've now got the UK government, 6 select committees, chose this organisation called Involve, which is funded by George Soros to do the job that they're meant to be doing. Does anybody see the problem here? I think most of the listeners will. Covered in our last few shows, basically on citizens' assemblies. Do have a look at that. Last week's one, UK shamed into stupidity. So the broad problems of academia are made great example of by the scientists and fact finders who have taken apart the work of these lobbyist drones who just work to order. That was what we're talking about with the paper there of Niels Axel Morner. When you are looking only for validation of a theory, there can only be one outcome, the one which is predicted by the intention. So in other words, people are just steered into the intended outcome at all times. It doesn't deviate from that. There is no debate anymore. But discussing these type of problems is the most important issue of the times, in my opinion, as the off-the-charts level of invalidated and repeated information, which is all for the sake of an intended outcome, has now eroded all need for debate. You don't see debate anymore. When weaponized military intelligence type rhetoric is applied to matters which basically should be proved beyond reasonable doubt, it must be clear that the idea is to impose one agenda. And that's just so clear. I'm going to give you a quote now from a paper by Clive Menzies from Critical Thinking. And I'm going to get Clive on the show in the weeks to come. He's been attending, along with another friend of Windows on the World, Eddie, these pop-up shops in Camden, this pop-up shop in Camden, which has basically been used as an Extinction Rebellion outlet. And the sort of childlike exercises they're putting through, you would not believe. And we're going to be covering that in future shows. And I might all be doing some videos about it. But basically, he supplied a quote within his report. And he said, today's academic gulag may be more humane than basically the gulags talked about by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Gulag Archipelago, sorry. But it says they may be more humane and pleasant, but it is no less a corrective labour system than the Russian Gulag. It is more effective because the inmates of Gulag academia are ignorant of their true condition and revel in their academic status granted by the political economy. So that's what it is. It's this appeal to ego and basically appeal to status that gets people every single time. When even so-called scientists say the science is settled, it's clear that the type of system described by George Orwell in 1984 is in place. Now, one look at a rolling news channel is enough to realise that the public are being treated with ever more assumption that they are stupid than any other time. I've never come across anything like as banal as what's going on at the moment. In the last 3 to 4 years, it's really escalated. But the recent London Bridge attack, like all these events, is a revealing way that all narratives are controlled, not by the media, but by those who the media defer to. So on to the next point here. This interview on details or question any aspect of the incident. It was all directed towards outcomes. That in future, terror-labelled extremists should not get released early from prison. This is what the narrative was about. Basically, this fella had gone to this conference and he had a tag on and he had a fake suicide vest on. Now, who would put a fake suicide vest on? It's self-defeating in every single aspect. Doesn't make any sense. But in the list of unanswered questions was why anyone would wear this fake suicide bomb belt and then stab a few passers-by in the same spot as the 2017 terror attack. The other anomalies are already out there, but as this is another agenda-led event, it's basically hardly worth mentioning all that. But interestingly, getting onto this and how can they roll this out on Sky News as somebody who's independent? So you've got somebody who's basically an arm of MI5 working for a government think tank who are renowned for trying to control the narrative of public opinion and putting out papers which basically go against anybody who is opposing this state gulag narrative. How can these be seriously on television? And they are all the time. But basically, at a debate with Demos a few years ago, these people from Demos, Carl Miller and Jamie Bartlett became the poster boy for Channel 4. I think he's probably working independently now as a change agent. Did state that they were regularly in contact with MI5 and they did take instruction from them. But the puppets of Demos basically produce papers which attempt to steer public opinion and are basically psychological manipulation and reinforce the imposed narrative without questioning anything. In other words, it's not a think tank. It's basically a repetition tank. These are in reality the things that they put out, manifestos for the mainstream's unquestioning presenters to reinforce on these rolling news channels. The papers produced by these subversive organisations are all the same and they never deviate. It doesn't matter whether it's the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, who we've also covered, who produced these sort of same type papers as Demos, which is basically about the rise of the far right, and then they try and validate it. They spout the same rhetoric. Now, it is, of course, as we know, the rise of the far right is the main rhetoric they use, which the state liars used to attach to Brexiteers or those who believe in even their own sovereignty. So I think this is a really important point. I'm just going to check that we're all still working on air. We actually went off air for a couple of seconds there. But of course, real extreme right-wing regimes like Netanyahu's, the Israeli Middle East regime of Netanyahu, whose lobbyists actually control all UK political parties, are of course never mentioned by the likes of Demos. The influence of the Israeli lobby would never be touched by them, would it? And basically, it's always the Europeans who are demonised by these propagandists, you know. The template for these hate-manufacturing, drone-like, unthinking and irrational organisations is always the same. They never deviate from this narrative and never express any ability for analytical thought. The word insight, this is the word that's alien to them. They're so ham-fisted with their over-the-top rhetoric, and it's never backed up with any facts. It doesn't have to be. In the post-truth world, though, all that is needed is to keep repeating cliches like the rise of the far right and promoting virtue-signalling liars who are incapable of the most basic checks and balances. Yet, checks and balances, do you ever get them? No. But the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, we've covered this in quite a few shows. It's basically a London-based think and do tank. I mean, think and do tank, that's how they describe themselves, that has pioneered policy and operational responses to the rising challenges of violent extremism and intercommunal conflict. Now, what's interesting about these sort of organisations, and the Institute of Statecraft was another one, which Chris Williams gate crashed and then was demonised heavily and has never recovered since. Because in his case, I think that had something to do with it. I don't think it's just this fake anti-Semitism lobby. I think it's actually something to do with that, which is why he's been targeted, because he really exposed that and knocked on their door. And in my view, was onto something very big. But yes, combining, it says, this Institute for Strategic Dialogue, getting back to that, they put out these papers which are ludicrous, and we've covered them. They want to back up this insane idea that Brexit is basically the far right. That's what they're doing. That's really what they're doing. But they say they combine research and analysis with government advisory work. Can you see how it all works? I mean, NGOs and these think tanks are basically controlling the narrative of public opinion, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is no different from any of them, even though it masquerades as a scientific body. But it says here, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue has been at the forefront of forging real-world, evidence-based responses to the challenges of integration, extremism, terrorism. What an absolute load of rubbish. It is just another branch of military intelligence led by third-party lobbyists for the destruction of sovereign idealism. That's the main point here. It's all about destroying sovereignty of mind and action. In other words, about destroying natural law, which some people would call satanic, and in actual fact is, because it's evil. So basically it's totalitarian groupthink. That's all these people are putting over. The demonising of everything outside it is repetitive, nonsensical and draconian at all times. This is enough to scare most of the public into inner conflict, and they get petrified of the iron fist side issues which are repeated every minute of the day by these indoctrinees, you know. But let's get to something quite important now, because we can now include Extinction Rebellion in this very evil group. One of the aims of Extinction Rebellion, which was leaked out, which ties into what George Soros is trying to do, obviously, what these subversive organisations are trying to do, and what the people who our government have now deferred to are trying to do with citizens' assemblies. One of the aims of Extinction Rebellion was to build structure, community, the C word, meaning the opposite, of course, meaning fragmentation, to build structure, community, or just a bunch of useful idiots, to build structure, community, and test prototypes in preparation for the coming structural collapse of the regimes of Western democracies. Now, you may actually realise that this has got nothing to do with climate change, has it? Because none of this has got anything to do with climate change. This is all about the collapse of the regimes of Western democracies. And how do you do that? You undermine them with negative propaganda. It says it now seems as inevitable. Basically the collapse of Western democracies now seen as inevitable due to stored up crisis. The crisis being manufactured, of course, thus preparing a foundation to transform society and resist fascism and other extremes. Well, fascism is Brexit, according to them. This includes creating, rising from the wreckage, a citizens' assembly based on sortition. Who's running the citizens' assembly? The sortition.org and My Society, and of course Involve. So all of this was planned and predicted a long time ago. The useful idiots of Extinction Rebellion are just repeating what they're told, as is every state actor who lies for a living. So with organisations as malevolent as Extinction Rebellion and the likes of George Soros being supported by the UK government, who have given Open Society the job of imposing democracy, the new democracy on the British public, it's clear that the UK Parliament has been openly subverted from the inside. But a quote from Demos, when Big Society came into being and the training of armies of narrative controlling drones got underway in an industrial rollout, is one that I have in my talk. Quote from Demos here. Now this was at the birth, after the birth, or on the afterbirth of the Big Society, which was Cameron's rollout of We're Change Agents, and this Saul Alinsky tactics, which is basically controlling the narrative and using, at the top end, terrorist tactics against the public. They said, Demos, the new democracy will work with a mixture of government open infiltration and citizens groups taking direct action. There is nothing allowed which is not being industrially enforced. That's my comment there. Nothing allowed here which is not being enforced on an industrial level by these malevolent organisations. It's absolutely incredible. And as a sort of note to finish off, I was going to get onto an article actually, but I don't think we've got time. So I don't want these shows to be too long. I want to start putting up stuff that's a bit shorter and doing some more videos. And also I'll be putting stuff up on Patreon, and there's some really interesting stuff there already on the documentary project I'm doing. But to sort of finish off tonight's show, I'd just like to tell you, there's an article about... It was about Glastonbury Town Council, which is typical of all town councils, of course. They're nothing special. But they've lied about this 5G moratorium and the rollout of 5G. And they've been caught lying and subverting the truth. So do look at that article. It's called Disgraced UK Council Can't Stop Lying. Of course, this is just a cookie-cutter template of every other council. But it refers to a newspaper article which came out called Abuse Hurled at Teenage Sea Cadets by 5G Protesters During Glastonbury Parade, which was put in this group of newspapers called Reach PLC, masquerading in this town as Somerset Live. You've got Kent Live, you've got Essex Live. It's the live publication run by Reach PLC. Now, we found that the council had openly lied in council meetings, and they'd assisted with the defamation of local people. This is not unusual, but when they start virtue signalling as though they've put out a moratorium on 5G and they somehow can stop it, then they really do need to be dealt with kind of efficiency and basically told by the public what they are, because this is going on all over the country and it's something I'm going to get into in future weeks. But really, the way to move forward on this, I think, is for people in small groups to start countering the use of the techniques being imposed by these consultations locally and these NGOs, these think tanks, this controlling of the public narrative through the Delphi technique, which is basically how to get people to agree. In fact, your citizens' assemblies are all run on Delphi technique, and we have covered that in a lot of our shows. But basically, we have this mission statement, and I have read it out before, but I'd like to read it out again. If you want to set up a group, and I'm not saying use this, because I don't want you to use it word for word. I wouldn't want anyone to do that. I don't believe in cookie cutter templates at all. But this is a kind of way of subverting the subversives. Okay, we are an unaffiliated group of local residents concerned about the lack of democratic process in local government planning and policy. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals, acting collectively and within the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard. We are not affiliated with any group or organisation whatsoever. This does not mean that we do or do not endorse other groups. We do not agree with arriving at a consensus through being steered into predetermined outcomes by trained facilitators, either working for the council or public-private partnerships. Right? Now, we deem this to be against the public interest and an affront to democracy. Now, let me just take that apart quickly. We are not affiliated with any group or organisation whatsoever. That means you can't be infiltrated. And what always happens with groups is you will be attached to something negative. So there'll be a right-wing extremist in your midst. And who knows who that could be? It could be you, it could be me, it could be anybody. But what they'll do is try and dig up something where they will attach you to a group with no evidence. And they'll say you are part of some other group that they deem to be extreme. So that is why you have to remain unaffiliated and say you're unaffiliated. We will remain unaffiliated as individuals acting collectively. In other words, there's no central leader. Once a leader is identified, they will be targeted and taken out, and a change agent will be put in their place. This is how it always works. This is how it worked at Occupy. This is how it works at anything. Any public group is always the same process. So remain unaffiliated and acting collectively within the law. That's very important because people often get accused of things they haven't done. So always stay within the boundaries of the law towards a truly inclusive democratic process where all voices are heard, not just the chosen few, not just the people who've been selected for the fake citizens' assemblies. This is the real citizens' assembly. This does not mean that we do or do not endorse other groups. I'm not saying that we endorse them. I'm not saying we do. I'm saying what we do is particular to this group. They may like what we do. We may like what they do. But that's not important. Very important point, actually. We do not agree with arriving at a consensus through being steered into predetermined outcomes by trained facilitators, either working for the council or public-private partnerships. This is very important because the word consensus just means it looks as though we've all agreed. It doesn't mean we have agreed. And predetermined outcomes are all that you will get in any public meeting. The outcome's already been decided. So in other words, you're saying, well, let's have some ballots on this. Let's see what people really think, shall we? This could be very effective. If this took off in the UK, it could be a great example of the people using social engineering to their own advantage. And just to finish off, it says, we deem this to be against the public interest and affront to democracy. That's arriving at consensus. It's against the public interest because the public aren't being heard. And it's an affront to what we call democracy. So that's about it for this show. I'm really appreciative of the information that people send in and the information that's conveyed to me when we do our talks. The information that I get from people is quite astounding, which means that most people have information that could be useful. So basically, we need more of it. And the information I got last night and the information that's been sent in is very, very helpful. So thanks to everyone who's doing it. And please book me or myself, Sandy Adams and Piers Corbin, all three of us, for a bigger picture in your local town, city or village. It is quite a lot of fun. It's a lot of information to take in, but It clarifies what is going on. And that was the purpose of this show tonight. So I hope you've enjoyed it. And until next week, that's it from Windows on the World radio show. But look out for our videos. I'm still going to be using YouTube, even though I don't want to be using YouTube. Our Spreaker shows get put up there. But a lot of our videos now have been taken down. I've recently just tried to monetize them to see if we can. And they keep getting demonetized and they say limited, you can't, advertisers don't want to hear this. And then when you appeal, they actually put it on. Not that it earns any money, but it's to prove a point. And the point is this. We need to get away from these bigger platforms and form smaller groups. And our stuff is available on BitChute. Please look on there. Please become a subscriber or a patron on Patreon, because I'm going to be uploading some stuff there, some very specialised stuff. That's it for tonight. And do keep checking the website. There's new stuff on there and we have a massive archive. So good night, everybody. That's it from Windows on the World. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net.